Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. I'm Natalia Shpilova-Said, and joining me today is Anya Abramyan. Today we're holding the Holodomor Commemoration lectures dedicated to the Holodomor Memorial Day, which is traditionally observed in Ukraine in November. We will have two lectures today, which will be followed by a Q&A session. And let me introduce our guests. Dr. Hiroaki Kuromiya, Professor of History at Indiana University and Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute Associate. Dr. Kuromiya studies modern and contemporary Ukraine in a wider context of Eurasian history. He has written on the Donbas, the Holodomor, the Great Terror, and other subjects pertaining mainly to the Stalin era. He authored a number of books, and I will mention only some of them. The Eurasian Triangle, Russia, the Caucasus, and Japan, 1904-1945, which was published in 2016. Зрозуміти Донбас, Understanding Donbas, which was published in 2015, and this book is also available in Russian, Понять Донбасс. Conscious on Trial, The Fate of 14 Pacifists in Stalin's Ukraine, 1952-1953, published in 2012. The Voices of the Dead, Stalin's Great Terror in the 1930s, which was published in 2007. Dr. Kuromiya will present a talk on the Holodomor and Democracies. Hello, Dr. Kuromiya.
Okay, shall we start now?
We have one more guest.
Yes, of course, yes. I'm terrible, sorry.
Tatiana Sopronuk is a proofreader at the Information and Publishing Department of National Museum of the Holodomor Genocide, Kyiv, Ukraine. Tatiana Sopronuk will present on public history at the Holodomor Museum, and she'll also be joined by Svetlana Markova, director at the Holodomor Research Institute, National Museum of the Holodomor Genocide. Hello, Tatiana and Svetlana.
Hello, pleasure to meet all of you.
Our discussion today will be moderated by John Shetechka. John Shetechka is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Michigan State University, where he is currently writing a dissertation on the aftermath of the 1932-1933 Holodomor and the 1946-1947 famine. John is also the founder and current co-editor of H Ukraine, a website dedicated to the promotion of academic and scholarly content related to the study of Ukraine. During the 2020-2021 academic year, John is a Fulbright Fellow to Ukraine. So we will start with Dr. Kuromiya's lecture, and please submit your comments and questions via the Q&A option, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. All questions and comments will be addressed during our discussion after the speakers present their talks. At this point, I will give the floor to John. Thank you, John, for moderating our event today.
Great, thank you so much for having me, and special thanks to the Ukrainian Student Organization at Indiana University for hosting what I believe is the first talk on Holodomor of this year. I will just give a couple of comments before I turn over the floor to Professor Kuromiya. I'd like to remind everybody that this year is the 87th anniversary of the Holodomor, which we are approaching next month in November, when commemorations usually take place. And to provide just a bit of context for these talks today, I'd like to kind of orient the study of the Holodomor in 2020. What has been a challenging year in terms of the pandemic has also been challenging and productive in terms of the study of the Holodomor. Our colleagues in Kyiv in August unfortunately had to deal with at the museum, which saw the Bitter Childhood Memory statue. It was an attempt to steal it, and it was slightly damaged in that attempt. But luckily for all of us, the statue was not harmed too badly, and I believe it is back up on its pedestal in front of the museum in Kyiv. This, to me, showed a contestation of the memory of the Holodomor in August on the eve of Ukrainian Independence Day. As far as I know, they still have not caught who tried to steal the statue, but it showed the presence of the Holodomor in 2020. So that's the bad news. The good news is, as of last week, the city of San Antonio, the city of San Antonio recently recognized the Holodomor, not only as the famine, but as a genocide in the state of Texas. This is adding to the growing list of cities in the United States that are recognizing the Holodomor, which is now at 25 states. So half of the US now recognizes the Holodomor. This is bringing more recognition to the study of the famine, So this is a positive thing. I'd also say that another good bit of news that came out of Kyiv last week was the release of the Holodomor History app, which was released for mobile devices. And this is a new way of bringing public awareness to the famine, and I hope that our speakers from Kyiv today will talk more about that as we get going. So 2020, although it's the 87th anniversary, it was not maybe as big as the 85th or what will be the 90th in a few years. It has been an interesting year, and the Holodomor has been in the media, and it's been in dialogue with academics. And there are a number of students and professors and writers and artists working on issues of the Holodomor and bringing what I think is a much needed perspective on new initiatives and new avenues of Holodomor exploration and understanding. So I'm very grateful to be part of this talk, which I see as the first one of this year, and to hear from Professor Kuromiya about the long history of the relationship between the Holodomor and the United States, which he will discuss, and then also what our friends in Kyiv are doing to bring awareness about the famine and the Holodomor to more public audiences, which is a much needed effort and one that I think we're supremely grateful for. So at this point, I'll turn over the floor to Professor Kuromiya, and he will speak for 30 to 40 minutes on the U.S. Relationship to the Holodomor. Professor Kuromiya.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. Now, I don't have much good news, actually. It's mainly bad news, but that's how things are, and we have to take it seriously. So today I'm going to talk about Holodomor in an international context. Now, I gave a similar talk to this one in Kyiv 4 years ago. And what prompted me to talk about this is the opening of the Holodomor Memorial to victims of the Ukrainian-Russian genocide in Washington in 2015. So this prompted the talk about democracies and the Holodomor. And I'd like to return to this theme later at the end of this talk. Now, like other modern historical event, the Holodomor did not take place in international political vacuum. One of the most troubling aspects of the Holodomor was that even though Moscow killed millions of people in peacetime, it managed to escape any serious international tension. It marked a stark contrast to the 1921-22 famine, when the international community, particularly the United States, extended assistance to Ukraine and Russia, the areas where famine affected, the famine affected. This was done even though the world was clearly, patently against the Bolshevik government and its violence. This was the situation in 1921-22, and the United States played an important role, the most important role in the assistance to the people, hungry people in the former Russian Empire, particularly in Ukraine and Russia. In 1932-33, it was again the United States that stood out, not because it extended help, but because it ignored it. It's well known, we all know that the New York Times correspondent in the Soviet Union, Walter Duranty, denies the existence of famine in the Soviet Union. But it is far less known that many democracies, most importantly the United States, did not voice their concerns vocally. This was in a sense the result of Soviet disinformation, but there are other specific national reasons as well. Take Poland, neighboring country. Poland did not voice their concerns vocally really because the 1932 Poland and the Soviet Union struck a non-aggression pact. And Poland was happy with that arrangement and did not want to make a big issue of the famine in Ukraine, even though they all knew about it. So the official policy was more or less to keep quiet. Now, other countries, France was similar, facing the potential threat of Nazi Germany. Hitler comes to power in January 1933. Even before that, France, fearing the resurgence of Germany, had come closer to the Soviet Union and concluded a non-aggression pact, just as Poland did with the Soviet Union. Japan, also a neighboring country, also tended to be quiet. Japan knew about it, but Japan had just invaded Manchuria in 1931 and created a puppet government called Manchukuo in Manchuria. And Japan feared Soviet intervention in this matter, it's military aggression. And it did not want to provoke the Soviet Union in any way. So they tended to be quiet. Although Japan was so divided that the right-wing people, some journalists, they made a big deal of it, but it didn't have much impact. Britain certainly did better. The Foreign Office collected enormous amount of documents, and there are good journalists such as Malcolm Muggeridge and Gareth Jones published revealing articles about the famine, particularly in Ukraine, in sharp contrast to what the New York Times Walter Duranty did. So Britain fared better, but it didn't go particularly far. In comparison with Britain, the United States was a miserable failure in this regard, unfortunately. And my contention is that Washington's silence amounted to an appeasement. I may use an even stronger word later, an appeasement of the dictator Stalin. We all talk about the famous appeasement, Britain and France's appeasement of Hitler in 1939. But we don't talk about Washington's appeasement of Moscow. We all tend to look at this period from the prism of the Cold War, in which the United States and the Soviet Union were the major adversaries. So we really don't think of this period, preceding period, as something of a secret honeymoon between Moscow and Washington. So this forgotten history is relevant to today's Ukraine, which is fighting against Russia's aggression. And one is naturally concerned about the West appeasement of Russia. We don't know what will happen to Crimea and the Donbas and so on. When it comes to the famine, we all know Amartya Sen's famous dictum that in the modern era, no famine can take place in democracy. But we have to ask if when a democracy fails to confront dictators, dictators tend to gain free handing, killing their own citizens. And this is exactly what happened at the time of the Holodomor in Ukraine. I have to say that, yes, the United States did not have diplomatic relations at that time. Diplomatic relations between the two countries opened only in late 1933 under Franklin Roosevelt. So the United States had no direct sources of information on the Holodomor. However, the United States had a diplomatic post in Riga, Latvia, which was independent at the time, and collected a great deal of information on the Soviet Union from Riga. And in other countries, diplomats from all countries often exchanged information and collected intelligence. In Ukraine, per se, at the time of the Holodomor, 6 countries had a diplomatic post, namely Poland, Germany, Italy, Japan, Greece, and Turkey. I do not know much about Greece or Turkey, but other countries certainly collected a great deal of information about Ukraine and the Holodomor. In comparison, Britain didn't have diplomatic posts in Ukraine. Nevertheless, it managed to collect a great deal of information on the famine in Ukraine from Moscow, from elsewhere. So the lack of diplomatic posts, US lack of diplomatic posts, was not a particularly important problem in information gathering. So that doesn't really excuse the United States, Washington. What mattered was, of course, a political orientation, American politics, international politics. And here one can certainly pose a question of appeasement, and I would say even collusion, to use a sort of popular or an expression often used in recent months in the United States in the past few years. So today, when the Ukraine is fighting against Russia's aggression, how democracies deal with Russia is an all-important question. And I think that the case of the Holodomor and democracies I'm going to talk about may teach us some lesson about today's pressing issues involving Russia, a critical issue for Ukraine today. Now, I said that the emergence of explicitly anti-capitalist, atheist regime in the largest country in the world, in the biggest country in the world, Russian Empire, was a serious threat to the capitalist West, and the capitalists intervened. But it's interesting to know that the appeasement of Russia dates back to the early years of the Bolshevik government. And I'd like to say a few words about it before I go on to the Holodomor period. The emergence of an explicitly anti-capitalist, atheist regime in Russia presented a serious threat, as I said. So the West did intervene militarily against the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War that followed the Bolshevik Revolution. But the Bolsheviks quite skillfully, very skillfully manipulated one imperial power against another and managed to survive. This is a terribly interesting process. There is much to be discussed, much to be analyzed here. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks survived. So by 1920, most countries gave up. In 1920, for example, when the Bolsheviks and Poland were fighting, Britain secretly took steps to normalize the relation with Moscow. And this is probably the first instance of the West appeasement of the Bolsheviks. And the Polish historian Andrzej Nowak published a very interesting book called Pierwsza Zdrawa Zachodu, the first betrayal of the West, about this particular case of Britain's appeasement. Very interesting book, but I would not go into this question. But I'd like to say a few words about American appeasement. American appeasement of Bolshevik Russia didn't really lag behind Britain's. And this relates to Washington's contention with Tokyo over hegemony in the Far East. So here, questions are connected all over on the Eurasian continent. Both the United States and Japan intervened in the Russian Civil War against the Bolsheviks. But the American intervention was not so much against the Bolsheviks as against the Japanese, because Washington was deeply concerned that Japan might occupy the Russian Far East, which Japan did, at least part of it. and monopolize all the economic opportunities the Western Far East might offer. So this was dramatic. So there was a sort of an implicit confrontation between Japan and the United States in the Russian Far East. And this was a dramatic change from the time of the Russo-Japanese War, in which the United States and Britain supported Japan against Imperial Russia, because both countries, Britain and the United States, feared Russia's expansion to Asia all the way from the west, 1,000 miles to the east. As I said, most countries, including Britain, gave up on crushing Bolsheviks by 1920, but one country refused. That is Japan. Japan persisted and kept military forces in Siberia and Sakhalin. And that made Washington very, very nervous. So here, interestingly, Washington and Moscow secretly began collaborating against Japan. First, Moscow set up, this is 1920, a front republic called the Far Eastern Republic, which sort of assumed the democratic facade. It's just a facade, in fact, the Far Eastern Republic, by and large, was controlled by the Bolsheviks in Moscow. And this democratic facade satisfied Washington, which saw that the Far Eastern Republic is not a Soviet republic, but a democratic republic, separate from the Bolshevik government. This happened under President Warren Harding and the Secretary of State, Charles Hughes. Shortly after the Russo-Japanese War, in which Japan beat the Russian Empire, the United States immediately turned against Japan as a potential foe in the future. So here, seeing a possible future with Japan, Washington wanted to keep Japan's navy smaller than the American Navy, and Moscow wanted to kick the Japanese forces out of the Soviet Far East. So what happened is that Moscow and Washington exchanged secret intelligence and made it impossible for Japan to keep its imperialist ambitions hidden behind its foreign policy. So the end result was Japan was forced to make concessions at the Washington Naval Conference from late 1921 to early 1922. And Moscow managed to kick out the Japanese from the Far East. It took a little longer to kick them out from Sakhalin. And in this process, some kind of secret agreements about American privilege in the Far East were apparently made between Washington and Moscow. But once Moscow had no intention of honoring such agreements, because they were saying the Washington, they're using this expression, padreci, it's scoundrels in Washington. They had no respect for American politicians, but they collaborated. So once the Japanese left the Far East, withdrew military forces, then Moscow abolished the Far Eastern Republic, absorbed it into the Russian Federation, and reneged on the promise it gave to Washington about some kind of American economic privilege in the Far East. So naturally, Washington felt betrayed by Moscow, and this was probably the most important reason why the United States never recognized the Soviet Union, and no diplomatic relations opened between the two countries until 1933. History books don't talk about these matters, but of course, we historians try to understand what actually happened behind the scenes. In the Stalin's personal archive, it appeared there were about 3, 4, 5 dossiers about the Washington Conference. But that is completely inaccessible. It's almost 100 years since the Washington Conference. The guide to the archive called OPS even doesn't say what the dossiers are, the titles are whited out. So we don't know what these files are, but we do know that there are 4 or 5 or so dossiers in Stalin's personal archive. So clearly there is a lot for them, for Moscow to hide still 100 years later about the Washington Conference. So ordinary explanation for why the United States did not open diplomatic relations was that, well, there was no freedom of conscience, no religion in the Soviet Union. Moscow conducts communist propaganda, and Moscow never compensated for the American assets confiscated by the Soviet government after the Bolshevik Revolution. These issues mattered, but what had mattered more seemed to be the Far East that interested the United States for future economic development. So this is the background to sort of American appeasement of Stalin at the time of the Holodomor. At the time of the Holodomor, American-Soviet collaboration became far more open, far more explicit, even though we know very little about it. Well, I know, but there is very little in literature. So I'd like to emphasize this point. This is an unfortunate part of American history, but we still have to discuss it. And again, this collaboration had everything to do with the Far East. So it turned out that the problems in the West, in Ukraine, had deep connections to what was happening in the Far East, 1,000 miles away. And there are many, many interesting anecdotes about these connections, which I discussed partially in my book, but I will discuss more in my forthcoming book. And the problem is here, is this. Japan invaded Manchuria militarily in September 1931. And then the following spring, Japan created a puppet government called the Manchu War. And this took place under President Hoover, Herbert Hoover in the US, who is a man who organized massive relief effort to Russia and Ukraine in 1921-22. He had no intention to come to terms with Moscow or Japan. He was a Republican. 1932 happened to be an election year in America, and Franklin Roosevelt, Democrat, challenged Hoover. And the famine in the Soviet Union in general, not just in Ukraine, there was some famine situation in other parts of the Soviet Union. It did not become an issue in the election campaigns. And Soviet disinformation worked nicely, including Duranty's report in the New York Times. It was only after Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, beat Hoover decisively in November 1932 that more reliable information became available. Margoliges, Jones reports, they came mainly in the spring of 1933 when mass deaths took place. But FDR ignored it, simply ignored it. He wanted to open diplomatic relations with Moscow in order to use the Soviet Union against Japan in the Far East. So FDR did not want any negative information about the Soviet Union. And during the presidential election campaign, Roosevelt never publicly advocated recognizing Stalin's government for fear of alienating millions of Americans who are ethnic Poles and anti-Soviet immigrants from the former Russian Empire. So he didn't discuss this. He interviewed Duranty and so on. He was deeply influenced by Duranty. However, We do know that FDR secretly instructed his trusted advisor, William Bullitt, who became special assistant to Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, to explore ways to open diplomatic relations with Moscow. This was done in top secret. He even instructed Bullitt to, burn all the papers and so on. Now, Bullitt was a pro-Soviet diplomat who knew Lenin personally in 1920 or so, maybe a bit earlier. He was a pro-Soviet American who went to Moscow, got acquainted with Lenin. So there was a sort of objection from Hull, the Secretary of State, and others who opposed the recognition of Stalin's government, unless two conditions were met by Moscow. One is the guarantee of freedom of religion, and the other was the cessation of communist propaganda by the Soviet government in the United States. There are other issues like compensation of the American assets confiscated by the Soviet government. In spite of this objection, FDR went ahead to recognize Moscow in November 1933 with the help of Bullitt and Skvirsky, who stayed on in the United States, who had come to the United States as part of the Far Eastern Republic in 1921. Now, the timing is critical here, November 1933. Roosevelt chose this date in order to please Moscow, please Stalin. Why did he want to please? Obviously, he wanted to use Stalin for his own purposes, political purposes. Via Bullitt, FDR let Moscow know that he had wanted to open diplomatic relations from the very beginning, but waited for the cold season, winter season, because the Japanese would take his move, recognition of the Soviet Union, as pro-Soviet, and might attack Vladivostok from the sea. And there was no such plan in Japan at all. But that was what FDR wanted to tell the Soviet Union. FDR waited for the port to freeze and to make Japan's possible attack difficult. Port means the Vladivostok port. Moscow was taken aback by this remark and thanked FDR's extraordinary generosity, but added that, thank you very much, but the question was no longer so important because of the development of air forces in the Soviet Union. And this effort of FDR to please Stalin is probably one of the most striking revelations from the Russian archives I've found. It's not discussed anywhere but in my book. The tone is just astonishing. And I also explored American archives, but I can't find this. Probably it's was communicated only orally. He didn't want to leave any paper trace. Then, of course, FDR appointed Bullitt as the first American ambassador to the Soviet Union. But Bullitt soon became very disillusioned by Soviet dishonesty and turned against the Soviet government. So Roosevelt replaced Bullitt with the infamous Joseph Davis, who reported that Moscow show trials were fair and just, not because he was convinced so, but because he wanted to please FDR, who wanted to believe that Stalin was a trustworthy political partner. We are often told that the resumption of diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and the United States in 1933 was directed against Nazi Germany. This was certainly not the case. It's very clear from Soviet and Russian archives that that was not the case. FDR, influenced by Bullitt, thought like Stalin that Hitler was so radical, so outrageous that he wouldn't last. It's not Nazi Germany is not a threat, but the threat is from Japan. That is very clear. Now, is this just one-time sort of pandering to Stalin by FDR? That doesn't seem to be the case. When Stalin invaded Finland in 1939, Roosevelt did not take strong stand. It was a moral support, but it did nothing. Britain and France did far more. During World War II, the United States stood on the side of the Soviet Union and fought against the Axis power. So that's understandable, but FDR's illusion about Stalin, that trustworthy politician continued. Strikingly, in 1943, Roosevelt went to Tehran, but from the archives, it's clear that Roosevelt wanted to stay in the same place with Marshal Stalin. It wasn't given, but he really was so interested in Stalin, so attached to Stalin. Another cases of Katyn massacres of Poles in 1940. In 1944, American Commission concluded that the massacres were committed by Moscow, but FDR ignored the conclusion. So it is really difficult to say, well, it is difficult not to say that FDR not so much appeased as pandered to the dictator Stalin. And it is clear that he certainly ignored the Holodomor. So I have a few minutes, so I'd like to conclude my short talk, and I'd like to go back to the memorial. Now, this is a very significant issue. FDR dealing with Stalin is regarded by the Americans as one of the most, one of the best regarded presidents ever in American history, along with Lincoln and others. Roosevelt took the country out of the Depression and to victory during World War II. He certainly pursued what he thought the national interests of the United States. But he did so in part by appeasing, or perhaps more appropriately, pandering to the dictator Stalin. And FDR's presidency cost quite dearly for smaller nations like Ukraine and Poland. Now, when the memorial to the victims of the Holodomor was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in October 2015, Marina Poroshenko, wife of Ukraine's President Poroshenko, attended its ceremony. The following year, 2016, President Poroshenko himself visited the memorial and thanked the United States. Yet, understandably, not a word was said about FDR's silence on the Holodomor at the time. So, let me conclude this talk with the following remark. The memorial is very dear to all of us in America as a reminder of millions of people who were killed in the Holodomor. But it should also be an eloquent reminder of our own failure, eloquent reminder of our own failure to confront dictators such as Stalin. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Kuromiya, for this great talk. Next, we will turn over the floor to Tetiana Soproniuk, who will talk about the Holodomor Museum and their efforts to educate the public. And after her presentation, we can collect questions. You can type them into the chat, and we'll have a chance to ask our presenters some questions after both presentations have finished. All right, Tetiana.
Thank you. So I want to share a screen to start the presentation. This one. Sorry. And so I hope you can see the presentation. I'm going to talk about public history at the Holodomor Museum First of all, I want to talk briefly about the history of our museum. So it was founded according to the law of Ukraine on the Holodomor of 1932-1933 in Ukraine, which was released in 2006. One of its articles included the idea of constructing the memorial, and in 2008 the memorial was finally constructed. And the next year, the museum started functioning there. In 2019, the memorial changed its name to the National Museum of the Holodomor Genocide. But this museum we have nowadays, it is only the first part of the museum. So this is only the memorial part. The large museum with proper infrastructure, with a lot of different halls, is now under construction, and we hope it will be built till 2023, to the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor. So when we speak about the Holodomor and about commemoration, the term memory site by Pierre Nora is very appropriate. So according to Pierre Nora, memory sites are places or objects in which the memory of the nation has become condensed, embodied, and crystallized to a particular degree. And the Holodomor Museum is definitely a very powerful place, a very powerful memory site related to the Holodomor. Actually, the Holodomor was a huge collective trauma for Ukrainian nation, and moreover, it was silenced trauma, and its effects are still visible. That is why, for example, James Mace, one of the leading scholars who studied the Holodomor, called Ukrainians post-genocidal nation, and probably he was right. To deal with post-traumatic effects, to overcome the trauma and overcome the effects of the genocide, one needs to talk this trauma out. And when we speak about the Holodomor, the object, the victim of the trauma was the whole nation. And how can we help the whole nation to talk the trauma out? And the easiest way is commemoration. So when we speak about commemorative practices, they can be divided into two large groups. The first one is nationwide commemoration, which is centered by the Holodomor Remembrance Day, the 4th Saturday of November. This year it is the 28th of November. And this day, President of Ukraine, Prime Minister, foreign representatives of foreign states visit the Holodomor Museum, light the candles, and so on. And to this day, our museum also launches the public servants announcement campaign. You can see them. You can see the last year public servants announcement on the slide. So a year ago, we were talking about different ways of survival. You can see different objects that are not edible, but which people were forced to eat to survive during the Holodomor years. But this year, our public service announcement campaign will be devoted to the different experiences of an individual, of the person during the and actually about the choices during the Holodomor. And when we speak about individual commemoration, the most important individual commemoration experience was invented by actually James Mace. He proposed the idea of candle of memory. So for Ukrainians, light the candle of memory is very powerful, and it is a very clear message. So lighting the candle is a very clear act. But so to explain it, on the Holodomor Remembrance Day, very much a lot of Ukrainian families at 4 o'clock in the evening light the candles and put them on their window sills. And this is the time when people share their family stories, and this is the possibility to transfer the knowledge about the Holodomor from one generation to another. But when we talk about individual commemoration, our museum is built as the memorial, as a commemorative object, and that is why visiting the museum, the Holodomor Museum, can also be a commemorative experience. So the museum includes many symbolic objects. The angels of sorrow, they are the symbolic sculptures that the visitors meet. First of all, they are like the symbolic guardians of the souls of victims. Bitter memory of childhood statue, which was spoken about today already. So it symbolizes the children who suffered during the Holodomor, who survived and who unfortunately didn't. And this is the statue people feel very deep connection with. So on the slide you can see the sculpture with the scarf on her shoulders. And a lot of this happened like 2 years ago. It was winter, and people felt like this girl, she was cold and covered her shoulders with the scarf. And people bring a lot of apples, bread, flowers, candles to the sculpture every day. And it is interesting that this girl is the center of both official and unofficial commemoration of the Holodomor victims. This statue was vandalized in August this year, but it was restored, and and now it is located near the museum. And there are also 3 such statues, if I'm not mistaken, 3 such statues in Canada. So this is definitely the most powerful symbol of the Holodomor. The candle of memory, so our museum is built in the shape of candle. And as I say, this is the reference to the tradition of lighting the candle of memory on the Holodomor Remembrance Day. When the visitor enters the museum, he or she goes down the stairs, and this is like the journey to the past, the journey to the very dark time of Ukrainian history. And inside the museum, near the altar of memory, one can light the candle to put a bit of light into these dark times and to commemorate the millions of victims. Inside the altar, there are the grains of wheat. One cannot count the exact number of grains of wheat located there. The same, we cannot count the exact number of the Holodomor victims. That's just impossible. And with visiting the museum ends on the platform near the Bell of Memory, and there is a very nice landscape. The visitor can see the left bank of Dnieper, and in this landscape is very different from the dark hall. So there is a light contrast from darkness to sunshine to the sunlight. And it also shows the contrast of human experience during the Holodomor years. The National Books of Memory of the Holodomor victims, they are located around the Hall of Memory, and the idea of restoring the names of the Holodomor victims, because the first part of each book includes the list of the Holodomor victims whose name we know nowadays. These lists are not completed. In all these books, we have about 1 million names, but the process of establishing the names is still going on. Every visitor can fill in the card. Everyone also can do this online, and tell us the names of his or her relatives or maybe neighbors who perished during the Holodomor years. The books also include the local documents and the memories of people who survived the Holodomor. And when it comes to the accounts of the Holodomor victims, they were a powerful way of work with collective trauma, because mostly people who survived the Holodomor and who lived till Ukrainian independence, some of whom are still alive, they have already found the way to talk their trauma out. They have already found the words they needed, and this is the way to make their experience less traumatic. The accounts of survivors are actually the basis of the museum archives. When it comes to children, they are very special audience for every museum, and especially for the Holodomor Museum. And to make the history of the Holodomor less traumatic for them, we use different techniques. The first one is not to talk directly about the Holodomor. And when we work with the youngest visitors, they are sometimes children at the age of 3 or 4 or 5 years old visit the museum. They can make the candle of memory with their own hands, or make the commemorative badge. And during these activities, children can learn the most basic information about the USSR, about the totalitarian regime, about communism, about human rights violations during 1932 and 1933, and so on. For teens, we offer different classes about fact-checking. So we teach teens to distinguish truth and lies and manipulations in mass media based on the materials connected to the Holodomor, because the Holodomor was silenced because of mass media and because of informational manipulations at that time. And we also teach students to work with primary archival sources, to work with historical documents, especially photos of 1930 to 1933, and the theory of Alexandra Radchenko, who was a teacher in Kharkiv region and who described the Holodomor in her private memoirs. So to conclude the first part, to conclude about commemoration, when we commemorate the victims, we have 3 aims, 3 goals. The first one is to ensure symbolic immortality of the victims. The second one is to overcome post-genocidal syndrome and other transgenerational effects of the Holodomor. And the last one is to prevent genocides from repeating again. Now, my colleague Svetlana Markova, director of the Holodomor Research Institute, will talk about the activities of her institution. So please, yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity to present our institute. Holodomor Research Institute was founded in 2018 as a department of the National Museum of the Holodomor Genocide. It's the first state institution that studies of the Holodomor genocide and mass artificial famines of 1921, 1923, and 1946-1947. Historical research of the Institute include a full range of scholarly activities, from archival search for historical sources, their attribution, analysis, systematization, and publication of research result, introduction of discovered archival documents into scientific use in the form of collection of documents and materials. The Institute employees take part of conference, roundtables, workshops, and panel discussions. Also, they join research expedition of the Holodomor Museum to find oral history materials to supplement museum collection. During 2019-2020, together with the Mikhailo Grushevsky Institute of Ukraine Archaeography and So Studies, a monograph, Ukraine and Ukrainians, a name as a battlefield, by Doctor of Historical Science, Professor Viktor Brehunenko, was published. In 2019, the popular brochure, The Holodomor Terminology, was printed. In 2020, 2 more books were released. The first one is Myths About the Holodomor by Viktor Brechunenko and Joseph Stalin, Field Marshal of the Holodomor, by Doctor of Historical Sciences Vasil Maruchko. In 2020, we are planning to present a collection of documents and materials, blackboards of Ukraine, Chernigiv region. It will include more than 600 archive documents and information materials about the blackboard as a means of repression. Also, a collection of documents by Doctor of History Science, Professor Natalia Romanets. The Holodomor genocide of 1932-1933 in the Dnipropetrovsk region, scale and consequences is being prepared for publication. In 2019, together with the museum and Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, a winter historical school, the Holodomor to know in order to be was organized. On the 19th of November 2020, the 5th Annual International Scientific and Practical Conference devoted to the Holodomor Remembrance Day will be held. This year, its topic is interdisciplinary approaches to the Holodomor studies. Its work will cover such fields as social, economic, political, legal, demographic, moral, and psychological prolonged consequences of the 1932-1933 Holodomor genocide in Ukraine. Convergence of the research results of the Holodomor genocide among scholars of history, political science, law, medicine, teaching, historical demography, psychology, etc. Memory about the Holodomor scholar research, its instrumentalization in politics, law, history, oral history, everyday life of Ukrainians during the Holodomor genocide. Thank you for your attention. Welcome to the conference.
Okay, so this was about the activities of the Holodomor Research Institute. And as you can see, the Institute conducts academic research, and while the Holodomor Museum presents the results for the whole Ukrainian and world community, and the easiest way to talk to a large audiences are the means of digital history. And the first and the most important project in the field of digital history is the Unified Register of the Holodomor Victims. So the basis of this database are the digitized national books of memory of the Holodomor victims, especially the list of the names. And as I say, it is impossible to name all the Holodomor victims. The communist regime destroyed the documents about mortality. In medical documents, it was forbidden to write down cause of death as famine. It was written by exhaustion or any other different way. In statistical data was falsified. That is why the basis for establishing the names of the victims are the accounts of people who survived the Holodomor and family memories. Actually, this unified register includes also the search system, and one can find their name by surname, by name, or by location. As I say, this system, as I said, the Holodomor victims' names, lists are still in process of fulfillment, and people can add the names to this list. The second project is devoted to the mass graves of the Holodomor victims. Why did we choose to talk about the mass graves? It was because in Soviet times the mass graves were concealed and destroyed. The USSR was doing everything to hide the evidence of the Holodomor, and over the mass graves, the authorities constructed playgrounds, houses, stadiums, children playgrounds, entertainment parks, roads, and so on. And to recover this memory, we decided to create the online resource. So our system contains the contemporary map of Ukraine and map of Ukraine as of 1933, and we mark the mass graves, and to these marks we add the brief historical summary, the photo if we have one, and the number or the approximate number of people buried there, if of course we have this information. The resource was created with the support of Ukrainian Cultural Foundation in 2018. To develop this database, the last year we decided to add the resource testimonies there, and we hope that it will become the unified database where all private accounts about the Holodomor and mass famines of the 20th century will be included. So where do we get the stories? First of all, we digitize our museum archives. Second of all, we still conduct expeditions to different regions of Ukraine to find the Holodomor survivors and to record their stories. And also many local historians do this. Many local historians record the Holodomor witnesses accounts, and we also try to include this information there. Also on our museum website there is the window "Share Your Story," where the visitor can just add the record or just the text of his or her family story about the Holodomor. So the mobile application Track Holodomor History was also already mentioned. It was released like a week ago. It is the newest project of the Holodomor Museum. So this is the mobile application which tells the history of the Holodomor in Kyiv. At that time, it was not the capital of Ukraine, and that is why its history of the Holodomor years remains like unknown and it is not studied well. So the app includes many locations of contemporary Kyiv, and to these locations we add archival photo if we have one, and the story of the building, the story of the street, the story of some person of the Holodomor years. And sometimes we do not give just the photos or just the stories. We try to work this story to somehow work with these stories, and some of them are presented as videos and even comics. So this is the way to talk with the young audience, because very often the generation of teens, the generation of young people, have lost the connection with the family stories. The stories get lost. The stories of their great-grandparents, they don't know them, and this is the way to tell them about the Holodomor in the way they understand. Also, this app has the interactive element, because we just ask the visitor to walk and to discover these places, and because many locations have so-called hidden content. So this is extra information which is available only within 400 meters from the location. So everyone can just walk along the streets of Kyiv and discover its past. When we talk about working with the young audience, the next project is also aimed mostly at young people. The project is called Holodomor Mosaics of History. This is the collaborative project of the Holodomor Museum and Ukrainer. So Ukrainer is very popular in Ukraine, is a very popular online medium in Ukraine. It is very popular among young people. So these, so they conduct expeditions to different parts of Ukraine and tell about cultural, historical, and geographical heritage of Ukraine. So this year we conducted the expeditions, which lasted for 30 days. My colleagues went to 64 villages and discovered and recorded 120 Holodomor victims, Holodomor survivors stories. We talked to 50 local historians. We discovered 66 mass graves, and as a result, we released 5 long video stories. 4 thematic videos, so the 5 videos are the stories of particular people, and 4 videos are just talk about the Holodomor in general. What is the Holodomor? How do we feel its effects today, the world, and the Holodomor, and so on. We have 2 short viral videos, and we have 9 long stories about the Holodomor. They can be found on our museum website, on YouTube, and on the website of Ukrainer online media. And the most important thing is that our museum has also found unknown photos of 1932 and 1933. So we're going to present them in the future. So these are the photos which are not known, which are not introduced into scientific use. We have also found a silver spoon and plate for fish. So these were the things, the parts of the dish set, which were not exchanged for food during the Holodomor years. We have also found a lot of other artifacts like embroidered blouses, embroidered towels, and so on. So we are still looking for artifacts of that times. And to move to the conclusions, we speak so much of memory because there is so little of it left, according to Kiernaram. And that is why the museum collects and saves as much historical documents and testimonies and memories as it can. Because preserving the memory about the crimes of the past is commemoration of their victims. Talking to the large audience about the genocides is also commemoration of their victims. And finally, preventing genocides from happening again is commemorating their victims as well. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Great. Thank you so much to both Professor Kuromiya and Tatiana and Svetlana, who I'm not sure is still there, but thank you if you are, for your presentation. There are a few questions in the Q&A, but I thought maybe I would offer just a couple of brief comments on the presentation that we just had. And actually, I think they complement each other quite well. The first by Professor Kuromiya talks about the United States and their relationship not only to Ukraine, but to other geopolitical entities in the world of the 1930s. I thought the relation to political differences and preferences in the east of the Soviet Union and with Japan were particularly important for understanding the Holodomor in a broader global political arena. And the fact that I think this shows that the United States story with Ukraine, although there was not diplomatic relations until November 16th, 1933, actually did not start when maybe most Americans think that this started in the US in the 1980s with the US Commission on the Ukraine Famine. Certainly the Ukrainian diaspora knew something of this, but Americans who are maybe not Ukrainian but had an interest in the Soviet sphere saw a big push in the 1980s for the study of the Holodomor with the start of this commission in James Mace. However, as Dr. Kuromiya rightly points out, they did know. And I've seen the documents myself from the Ukrainian relief committees in Lviv and Berlin and Prague and elsewhere that wrote to the US embassies and consuls in other countries, particularly Brussels. I was actually just reading these for my dissertation, and they write to the American consuls and ask for help directly, right to the American consuls. And if you read the replies back, they're in German and French and Ukrainian for just to make sure, and English, some of them, to make sure that they're understood in the language of the receiver. The US directly says no. Now, this doesn't come from the mouth of FDR, but certainly he would have been aware of what his consuls were getting in terms of information. We also have documents from the embassies and consuls of Poland and Japan who actually had a meeting about relief for Ukrainians in Soviet Ukraine in 1933. The members of the Polish embassy and the Japanese consul actually met in a secret meeting, but they also did not want to upset the Soviet Union, as Dr. Kuromiya pointed out. So there were geopolitical stakes here as well. And so I also want to bridge this because at the end of his talk, Professor Kuromiya talked about the Holodomor Museum as a memorial, a place that now serves as a reminder for us to pause, to visit, to stop, and to reflect of the failures of what happens when you don't address issues like the Holodomor in real time, of which we now have evidence that the US knew what was going on. And so this museum is now a place where I might call it a site of responsibility, right? Not just a museum, not just a tool of learning, but a site of responsibility where we have to go and understand what countries knew and what they didn't. And as it turns out, a lot of countries and a lot of nations did know what was going on. And there were some attempts to understand the famine in real time, although they were overshadowed by a lot of other geopolitical things that were happening. Now, I think this brings us to Tatiana's talk and Svetlana's talk on what the museum is doing. And from my understanding and from the presentation that we just heard from our colleagues in Kiev, the museum has responded to this call of responsibility that Professor Kuromiya laid out in his talk about the United States. And I knew about some of the initiatives that the museum is doing, but I think I speak for a lot of us when I guess I didn't understand how much you were doing. Frankly, I'm very impressed with the amount of work that you're doing. The last time that I was at the museum was in 2018. In the summer, and of course I visited, as I always do when I'm there, but it did not have these certain elements of interactiveness that I now see happening. The Holodomor app is certainly one. This is one that I think those of us who teach, and particularly teach Eastern European history, Soviet history, and the Holodomor would like to bring into our classrooms. This is something that I think we can bring this into our students, especially, most of our students like to be on their cell phones, and they like to use apps. So this is a way to engage interest in the Holodomor. And for the United States, particularly for those of us who want to teach about what Professor Kuromiya has just talked about, we might understand that the US actually has a role in the history of the Holodomor. It's just not talked about. And this might spark interest for those of us who want to write about the US connection to Soviet Ukraine, to the Soviet Union, to start engaging with the Holodomor through public initiatives like the ones that the museum are doing. So I, for one, am very happy to see this app come out, and I'm very happy to use it in Kiev. I'm supposed to be in Kiev at the moment, but the pandemic has stopped this. I also hope that the application in due time will expand beyond Kiev. I hope that there are histories of Kharkiv and Odessa and the smaller regions, the villages, right, to get people out of the city and into the zones. Oh, okay, and as well we're expanding that. That's great, and these all take time. But to see these initiatives move beyond the cities is fantastic, and I think it's going to, get a new generation of younger children and younger scholars involved in the Holodomor in ways that were not possible before. So these are the connections that I see happening between what we heard on the United States and also what's happening in Kiev, and I hope that these tools as well, if we heed Dr. Kuromiya's advice about paying attention to what's happening in real time as to not let these things happen. The US has a responsibility now, I think, based on this presentation, whether we call it appeasement or collusion with the Soviet Union, we have a responsibility now to get involved and to become knowledgeable about the famine, to understand it better, and to write about it more openly, and understand that the famine takes place not just within Soviet borders, but also outside of Soviet borders in terms of information and disinformation campaigns. So these connections, I thought, really came out between the two talks. Now, there are a number of questions, and I will stop there as to not take up too much time. But Natalia, should I read the questions out? Is that okay, or would you like to do that?
Yes, please.
Okay, I will take them in order then, as I've received them. So the first question that we received was from Valentina Harkun, and I believe this will be directed to Tetiana and Svetlana. She asks, who initiated the museum's name change and why was it done? So I think she means from when it was changed to the National Museum of the Holodomor Genocide. When did that take place and why was it done?
We changed the name a year ago, and it was done in order to reflect our activities directly. So when we speak about, first of all, it is connected with the process of constructing the second part of the museum. So just to distinguish the first, the memorial part, and just to say that we are not just the memorial, that we are like the museum, and to stress the idea that the Holodomor was genocide, in order not to raise this question again, like in Ukraine. So this was that was the idea of changing the name, and I wonder who was. So this was just the idea of some NGOs. The idea this was the idea of society, the Ukrainian community, and that is why we decided to do that.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Christine. She writes, I am the daughter of a Holodomor survivor who passed away in 1982 in the United Kingdom. How many survivors did you manage to contact to build up your records at the museum, and when did these records start?
So when we speak about the recording the Holodomor victims, the Holodomor survivors' testimonies in general, they started in the US. They started a bit earlier in the 1980s due to the initiative of James Mace. In Ukraine, they started after Ukraine became independent, and it is impossible to count how many survivors did people manage to record. The museum was recording the museum has been recording the Holodomor witnesses accounts since it was constructed, since it was opened, and we are still doing this. So just this year, as I said, we recorded 120 Holodomor victims just as a part of Holodomor Mosaics of History project, and this number is very, very, very huge. So we have hundreds and thousands of Holodomor victims, Holodomor survivors' testimonies in our museum collection, in our museum archives. Unfortunately, I can't say the direct number. It is impossible. Because every day we receive like new records.
Yes, this is an issue that I think often is asked of those of us who work on the Holodomor as counting victims, and this is a hard answer to come up with because we have to give a range. It's near impossible to give a definitive number. The next question asks, again for the museum, do you plan to collaborate with other institutions on the Holodomor? And I guess I might add, what other institutions are working on the Holodomor and with whom would you collaborate?
I will be translating this to Svetlana and translate her answer into English again. Питання, чи планує інститут співпрацювати з іншими інституціями? So the institute is now at the stage of looking for partners and signing the memorandums, signing starting its collaboration, because the institute was found in 2018. So now the institute is at the stage of signing the memorandums with Ukrainian universities and especially departments of history of the universities. We also collaborate with the Ukrainian Institute of Archaeography in source studies of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, with Chernihiv National University, Kamyanets-Podilsky National University. So now the primary goal is to establish communication with academic institutions and with universities and archives.
Great, thank you so much. And one more question for the museum. They have lots of questions for you today. When is the museum scheduled to be completed in the new phase? And is there a narrative for the exhibitions that are being created?
So the museum is planning to be opened in 2023, and it is now under construction. Speaking about the narrative of the exhibition, it is in the process of creation. So we are, the team, which consists of architects, Holodomor Museum, contemporary Holodomor Museum employees, and many other people. They're working on the exhibition plan and working on the narrative. So this is the process. This is just writing process, but you can see the project, the architectural project of the future museum, not the inside, but like the outside, on the website of the fund of the Holodomor Victims Memorial Development.
Great, thank you. This next question perhaps would be good for Professor Kuromiya to answer. The question is, what was the role of left-wing Western intellectuals who upheld the Soviet Union as a model for humanity in ignoring and denying the Holodomor and other Stalinist crimes?
Yes, thank you. No, I mean, they played very bad role. The Holodomor unfortunately coincided with the rise of fascism, Hitler's ascension to power, Japan's aggression against China, and therefore Western intellectuals were overwhelmingly pro-Soviet. The information, of course, reached these countries. Information reached these intellectuals, but they underestimated or ignored it. That was not their priority. So, no, they certainly carry the responsibility for ignoring or at least minimizing the problem of famine in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine in particular. And this was typical. I mean, many Western intellectuals ignored the Great Terror, that some believe that it was just or fair. So yes, intellectuals are to be sort of, they should, think about their own responsibility. Of course, most of them are dead, but that also, pose a question of our own responsibility for the current situation, for the conflict between Ukraine and Russia.
Yes.
War between, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I would also add too to that, if you read publications that maybe, from the 1930s that have to do with American relationships in the Soviet Union, I think of a publication like the Economic Review of the Soviet Union, where there are American business interests in developing Soviet industry. If you read these, you can read reports from those individuals who are actually working on the ground in the Soviet Union, many of them in Ukraine, who are writing very openly that they've heard reports of famine, but they're there and they can guarantee that that's not true. So in addition to these intellectuals who have a Soviet agenda or, are actually believing in the socialist future at this time, you have very real people in the sense that they're not sitting maybe in an ivory tower, but they're sitting in these factories where they're actually making money, and the Soviets are paying them, money to build industry there, that are actively, they're denying these things. Whether they've seen them or not, we don't know. but they're relaying this information in English to business readers, right? So this shows us something about the spread of information as well in that context.
Yeah, some of them may have been dishonest, but some of them were shielded from seeing the reality by the Soviet authority. It's a Potemkin village. They must have known something, but you know, they had every reason not to check it because they were being paid. Although, you know, by mid-1930s, most American engineers and these people left here. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and individuals like Fred Beal, who worked in the Kharkiv factory plant, you know, you can read his biography where he talks about believing in the socialist dream and then witnessing the famine firsthand and coming back. So we have these accounts as well. And, you know, a number of other people that went over there and observed what was happening and told the truth about what was going on. Mm-hmm. It looks like we have a question in the chat, and this comes from Joanna. And it says it's a question for Tatiana and Svetlana. Their question is, the commemorations of Holodomor in Ukraine seem to have a strong national character, which is perfectly understandable. But could they, or do they, possibly function as a vehicle to commemorate a range of unacknowledged Stalinist crimes in the former USSR? Could we imagine the crimes that cannot be officially commemorated in Russia to be folded in the Ukrainian commemorations? In other words, could we imagine the languages of commemorations that would allow us to go beyond the national human rights? Finally, is going beyond the national something that is possible, needed, or wanted in the current political situation? It's a long question. I apologize. I hope I read that correctly.
Yeah, that's a pretty long question. I'll translate this to Світлана. Власне, шанування жертв Голодомору в Україні має такий потужний національний характер, це, власне, дуже зрозуміло, але чи можемо ми функціонувати як такий транспортний засіб власне, чи можемо ми бути транспортним засобом для комеморації жертв інших сталінських злочинів в колишньому СРСР, чи можемо ми уявити, що злочини, які не були офіційно вшановані в Росії, щоб не розгорнулися в українській комеморації, іншими словами, чи можемо ми уявити, чи можемо ми, власне, запропонувати мову комеморації, яка вийшла би за межі національного, ну, наприклад, як права людей, які вже були згадані в презентації, і чи може, власне, комеморація вийти за межі національного до чогось, власне, загального? Yes, so the answer is definitely yes, and I would add from my own. So this is very, very important issue to talk not just about national, but the problem is that even in Ukraine, the Holodomor is topic which is usually discussed like in November and not in other time of the year. Why do we have this connection with the national? This is because the Holodomor is somehow the trauma this is the topic which unites us as a nation. This is a very common historical experience for almost every Ukrainian family, and this is the way to build up a nation. And since Ukrainian nation is still in this process of defining itself, the Holodomor is very important for this national building process. But yes, to communicate, especially with foreign audiences, and to communicate about the other USSR crimes, yeah, we can be this vehicle of commemoration and talk about other issues, and so that's what we are starting to be doing like nowadays. That is why we decide to work to look for new ways of telling about the Holodomor and about communism with larger audiences.
Great, thank you for that answer. I know it's a long question, so I hope we answered that, Joanna. If I may just ask one more question, unless someone else has one, I wanted to ask Professor Kuromiya about sources, actually. I was lucky enough to hear your talk last year in Edmonton on Japan and the Holodomor, but you talked a lot about these geopolitical considerations of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Japan. And I'm curious if you could just briefly tell us what kind of sources exist from the Japanese perspective, and what do they say about what's happening in Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s during the famine? I think you're muted.
Yes, source is a problem because Moscow's intelligence was such that many documents that are not available in Japan, which are mostly burnt at the end of the war, are available in Moscow. Some end up in various parts, Britain, Poland. Poland has good archives, sometimes in Washington, sometimes in China. And I even went to Mongolia twice to explore its archives. So no, there is no good place. You have to go everywhere and see what is available. So yes, of course we have source problems, but by putting together bits and pieces of information, by talking to people, some people still know something, you can find a great deal. Although the final answer, fire, smoking gun, these things don't come out. As far as Japan is concerned, they knew a great deal, but they also did not want to discuss in public. At that time, before World War II, it was very secret-oriented. They really didn't want to discuss their policy in public, which was taken advantage of by Stalin. Stalin worked extremely well to pit Japan and the United States against each other. So Stalin gained by not fighting against the Japanese, let Americans fight Japan, and then at the end of the war, the Soviet Union came in and beat the Japanese, and so on. So yes, as you see, source is a problem. The most important sources are in Moscow, which Moscow still jealously guard. So yes, there are problems. I mentioned the Washington Conference documents. In Stalin's intelligence correspondence, there's even such sections, intelligence and so on. Most of the documents on the United States are open. Quite a bit on Poland open, but almost nothing on Japan, and there is nothing whatsoever on the Washington Conference. The title is there, Washington Conference, Chicherin, Stalin, and so on. Chicherin was the foreign minister. Nothing, even the title they don't want to show to us, so it's whited out. The titles are all whited out. God knows what's in it. So there is much to hide. So what we know is just, parts of the picture. And if archives in Moscow open up completely, we'll have a better picture. But whether that sort of time comes in the near future, I have no idea whether it ever will come. They certainly destroyed quite a bit. Or they took many documents out of Moscow to Siberia or to the north so that they could not fall into the hands of people so easily in Moscow. So now the situation is very bad. However, certain documents end up abroad, Mongolia, China, Japan, and so on. So sometimes, yeah, by exploring, and as I said, in Poland, in Polish archives. So by exploring all these archives, you can get some picture. I mentioned Mongolia. In 1932-33, Mongolia was in great crisis, civil war, really. 1/3 of the land was, rebelling against the government, pro-Soviet government. When Ukrainians were dying of hunger, Moscow gave quite a bit of foodstuffs to Mongolians to placate the Mongolians. No one talks about it, but from the archives, it's very clear. It was a small country, only about 700,000 people, so it's not a huge amount of foodstuffs given to Mongolians. Nevertheless, they didn't feed the Ukrainians, but they fed the Mongolians.
Great, thank you. Yeah, very interesting, and it seems as if there's a lot of work to do in terms of sources in a lot of places that we might not think to look right away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good. Natalia, do we have time for one more question? It looks like there's...
Yes, we have one more question in our Q&A box. And I think this question is very nicely connected with the question which was asked by Joanna Nijinská, with that emphasis on the national and the international and the commemorative practices of the Holodomor. And I can read out this question. Thank you all to all the speakers. What's the status of an international recognition of the Holodomor as genocide?
So as of today, 17 countries of the world recognize the Holodomor as genocide nowadays. But this process is going on, and we hope that this number will grow in the future.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything to this, John, Professor Kuromiya?
I will just say thank you to all of our panelists for joining, and thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Kuromiya. Thank you, Tatiana Supranyuk, Svetlana Markova. Thank you, John Shetechka, for moderating this conversation. Thank you for actually participating in this event, which contributes to our understanding of the trauma of Holodomor, which is not confined and limited to national dimension only, but it goes beyond the national dimensions, and it can be extrapolated on the global level and international dimension. Thank you for attending our lecture today, and please join us next time. Information about upcoming events will be posted on the UkrSO listserv and on our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel. For future events that we will post, please subscribe to our channel.